They were mothers, wives, daughters, women you'd never suspect. But behind closed doors, they became monsters. From mothers who slaughtered their own children, to wives who plotted their husbands' murders, these 10 women committed crimes so savage, even hardened criminals are terrified of them. These aren't horror movie villains. These are real women, living behind bars right now. From vicious child killers to cunning conspirators who turned love into lethal traps. Their crimes are so dark, they've become legends inside prison walls. In this video, we are counting down the most evil women killers locked away in America's prisons, and the twisted, shocking stories behind each one. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. These stories are graphic, disturbing, and impossible to forget. If you're addicted to true crime that keeps you wide awake at 3 a.m., hit that subscribe button right now and join the Mindframe True Crimes family. And to all my incredible returning viewers and loyal subscribers, thank you for helping me shine a light on the darkest corners of the human mind. Now, let's open the cell doors and meet the women whose names are whispered in fear. Case 1. Tabitha Msina. Tabitha Msina once looked like any teenager you'd pass at the mall. Dark hair, wide eyes, a quiet smile that gave little away. But beneath that quiet exterior simmered a storm that no one, not even her own father, could see coming. On the humid summer night of July 28, 2007, in South Euclid, Ohio, Tabitha's world shifted forever. She was 18, fiercely in love with Carlos Christopher, a 19-year-old with a troubled past and a dangerous charisma. Together, they were inseparable, two misfits bound by secrets and seething resentment. Earlier that day, Tabitha sat at a local diner with Carlos, nervously pushing scrambled eggs around her plate. She didn't know it, but that greasy plate of eggs and burnt toast would become, in a haunting way, her last meal of freedom. She barely touched the food. She couldn't stop replaying the argument she'd had with her father, Richard Msina. He'd forbidden her from seeing Carlos again. In Richard's eyes, Carlos was nothing but trouble. A boy with no future, a boy who would drag his daughter into darkness. As the July sun sank behind the trees, shadows grew long in the Msina house. That night, Tabitha and Carlos quietly slipped into the house while her father and his girlfriend, Sandra K, lay sleeping. But they didn't come empty-handed. Carlos carried an axe. Tabitha wielded a crowbar. Inside the silent bedroom, rage exploded. The blows fell fast. Richard Msina was struck at least 6 times with the axe, each strike slicing deeper into flesh and bone. Blood spattered the walls, soaking the sheets, pooling on the floor. Sandra screamed and tried to fight back, but Tabitha swung the crowbar at her again and again. When the frenzy finally stopped, 2 people lay dying, their bodies twisted on the bed where they'd once sought safety. Neighbors would later say they'd heard nothing that night. No screaming, no thuds, no final cries for help. The house seemed swallowed by silence. By dawn, Tabitha and Carlos were gone, fleeing in stolen cars, trying to outrun the blood that clung to their hands. Their escape was short-lived. Days later, police tracked them down, sleeping in a stolen SUV outside a motel in North Carolina. Inside the car, officers found blood-stained clothes, weapons, and most damning of all, the murder weapon itself. In those first hours after her arrest, Tabitha said almost nothing. Sitting in a stark interrogation room, she stared at her hands. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she murmured her final words of freedom. "I just wanted to be free. I didn't mean for this to happen." But the evidence told a different story. At trial, prosecutors painted Tabitha as the architect of the killings, a daughter driven by hatred, manipulation, and a desire to cut her father out of her life for good. Tabitha insisted that Carlos was the real killer, that he'd manipulated her, threatened her, convinced her she had no choice. Yet she couldn't explain why her fingerprints were on the crowbar, or why she'd helped plan the attack. In the courtroom, Tabitha avoided looking at the photographs of the crime scene. The images showed blood covering the bedroom floor like spilled paint. It was almost impossible to reconcile the soft-spoken girl at the defense table with the carnage splashed across those glossy prints. Psychologists later described Tabitha as a young woman twisted by a chaotic childhood, A house filled with screaming, substance abuse, and violence. They called her naive, malleable, easily manipulated. But others weren't convinced. Detectives who'd worked the case said she was cool, calculating, fully aware of what she was doing. In the end, the jury took no pity. Tabitha Msina was sentenced to 60 years to life in prison. She will be eligible for parole in 2067 when she's 78 years old. A lifetime spent behind bars for a moment of murderous rage. Years later, in a rare interview from Dayton Correctional Institution, Tabitha confessed to her role. Her voice trembled as she admitted her guilt. "I was definitely guilty. I see that day every single day. I can't wake up from it." She said she regretted everything, that she wished she could go back and stop herself. But for many, that remorse feels hollow. 2 people are dead. A family is gone. And the sweet-faced girl who once dreamed of finishing high school has become a woman whose name still chills anyone who remembers the night of blood and betrayal. Carlos Christopher was also convicted of aggravated murder for his role in the brutal killings of Richard Messina and Sandra K, and was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. Case 2. McKenzie Sharilla. It began like any teenage night, music blasting, friends packed into a car, hearts pounding. But for 17-year-old McKenzie Sharilla, this ride was anything but typical. It would shred friendships, destroy lives, and leave a haunting question: murder or accident? On a late summer evening in Ohio, McKenzie climbed behind the wheel with 2 friends beside her. Laughter mixed with radio static, the world outside a blur. This would tragically become the last ride of innocence, a moment that would taint her forever. Suddenly, the car hurtled to nearly 100 miles per hour, snapping out of control and crashing headlong into a brick wall. 2 teenagers died instantly. McKenzie, badly injured, stumbled out, survivor and driver of catastrophe. At first, the community mourned, assuming this was a tragic accident. But then whispers emerged. This car hadn't lost control by chance. Detectives saw reckless speed. Witnesses recalled McKenzie pushing the pedal far too far. A full-scale investigation ensued. The autopsies, crash reconstruction experts, and forensic teams poured over the wreckage. Soon enough, prosecutors made a shocking announcement. McKenzie wasn't just driving dangerously, she was being charged with murder for killing her 2 friends. Murder. The word echoed. How could it be? She was their friend. They trusted her with their lives. What dark impulse drove a teenager behind the wheel into a lethal crash? Inside the courtroom, the prosecution wove a meticulously chilling narrative. McKenzie had steered the vehicle into the brick at full speed. There was no evidence of mechanical failure, no brake marks, just a climax of teenage recklessness, or something colder. But McKenzie's defense told a different story. The crash was a tragic accident. She had fainted behind the wheel, a rare medical episode she'd never experienced before. A momentary blackout, not malice, they argued. Psychologists later dissected this teenage dynamic, how grief, trauma, and guilt can bend a story. McKenzie emerged from interrogation dazed, checking her jewelry like she was more afraid of losing rings than lives. Friends remembered a vibrant girl, bursting with ambition. Could her own subconscious impulse have sent them to their deaths? On the stand, trauma blurred with strategy. The prosecution presented the crash as a final betrayal, trust shattered in the blink of an eye. The defense countered with fear, medical uncertainty, and a desperate adolescent at the center of tragedy. Media explosion followed. Hell on Wheels pieces peppered social feeds. Podcasts labeled it killer or accident. True crime fans rewatched body cam footage, dissected every hesitation in her voice, every glance in the courtroom. But the most haunting question remained, what were McKenzie's final words before the crash? Investigators pieced together her last texts. "I don't feel good," she messaged one friend. Another heard her mutter in the car, "I can't see." Was it dizziness, panic, or calculated confession? When the crash came, there was no final defiant scream. Just twisted metal, shattered glass, and 2 teenage hearts stopped forever. The court arrested time. It parsed out motive, intent, negligence. Medical experts testified she had a history of fainting spells. Crash analysts argued her steering angle was deliberate. Witnesses said she had been speeding moments before impact. The jury's verdict would redefine McKenzie's life. Not survivor, not victim, but potentially a murderer. The court found her culpable, sentencing her to prison for vehicular manslaughter, if not murder. The world watched, polarized. In prison, McKenzie sits with that weight. Some say she sleeps in silence, haunted by doomed faces. Others whisper she's still scheming a comeback to plead innocence. But whether remorse or preservation, her eyes remain haunted, trapped in a night that ended not with laughter, but tragedy. Case 3. Crystal Candelario. On June 6, 2023, the sun rose over Cleveland, Ohio, unaware of the horror unfolding behind one suburban front door. Inside, 32-year-old Crystal Candelario closed the door behind her, boarded a flight to Detroit, and soon after basked barefoot on a Puerto Rican beach, smiling for the camera as she posted, "The time that is enjoyed is the true time lived." But back home in that quiet house, 16-month-old Jalen lay alone in a soiled pack-and-play, clutching a few stray bottles of milk. For 10 days, the toddler's desperate cries echoed through empty hallways. A neighbor's doorbell camera caught her sobs in the dead of night, the sound of abandonment reaching ears that should have answered. Crystal returned home on June 16th, greeted not by laughter or relief, but by tragedy. Jalen was unresponsive, emaciated, severely dehydrated, her body limp among urine-soaked blankets. First responders knelt beside the toddler, their faces pale. The Cuyahoga County medical examiner later confirmed the cause of death: starvation and severe dehydration. Not malice, but neglect so extreme it became murder. In that moment, Crystal's world shattered. Before officers arrived, she dressed her daughter in a clean outfit, meticulous, yet too late. A distraught 911 call followed. "Please, help me. My daughter is dying." Within days, Crystal was arrested, charged with aggravated murder and child endangerment. Prosecutors called it the ultimate betrayal, pointing to the beach photos and her carefree vacation as damning evidence of cold indifference. Animals take care of their infants better, prosecutors argued, their voices trembling with disgust. During the interrogation, Crystal claimed she had been struggling: depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts. She revealed she had stopped taking her antidepressants before leaving home. Her defense argued she was overwhelmed, not evil. Her mental health a grim backdrop to a tragic lapse. At trial, jurors saw heart-rending details. Dr. Elizabeth Mooney, deputy medical examiner, described a toddler so dehydrated she weighed 7 pounds less than at her last doctor's visit. Her body failing over days, not hours. Prosecutors revealed the videotaped cries replayed like a refrain of desperation. Crystal's parents stood in court, tearful, pleading for clemency. They painted her as a loving daughter, overwhelmed, broken, but promising mercy. The judge would later hail their plea, yet also deliver a verdict that would define their family: life in prison without parole. On March 18, 2024, Crystal stood before Judge Brendan Sheehan to hear her fate. As he passed the sentence, the room grew still. "Just as you didn't let Jalen out of her confinement," he declared, "so too should you spend the rest of your life in a cell without freedom. The only difference is prison will at least feed you and give you liquid that you denied her." In that courtroom, Crystal finally spoke her final words of accountability, not of rage, but of regret. "There's so much pain that I have in regards to the loss of my baby. I'm not trying to justify my actions, but nobody knew how much I was suffering and what I was going through. God and my daughter have forgiven me." She pleaded for forgiveness, yet for those who mourned Jalen, it rang hollow. The plastic playpen, the spotless beach photos, the text left unread, all spoke of chilling detachment. A mother's failure transformed into a child's death, and every unanswered cry burned itself into the memory of a broken community. The psychological horror of this case lies not in a violent act, but in the slow unraveling of care. How did a mother leave her child with a few bottles of milk and a hope that would kill her? What desperation drove Crystal away, and what inner walls fell behind her? This story begs questions about mental illness, responsibility, and the darkness that can slither beneath love. Can depression be weaponized? Or is selfishness what truly kills? The courtroom heard tears and pleas, but the empty space beside Jalen's crib will forever echo louder. Case 4. Heather Nicole Matthews. The air in Dayton, Ohio, was crisp and festive in late December 1992. Christmas lights shimmered on front porches, families gathered for dinner. But under the twinkle, a darkness took root that would soon shatter the holiday's joy. That darkness belonged to Heather Nicole Matthews, a 20-year-old caught in a spiral of violence. Heather, white, 20, fiery yet quietly vulnerable, had drifted into the orbit of Marvelous Keene, a charismatic yet violent 19-year-old ringleader. Along with teen accomplices Laura Taylor and Heather's boyfriend DeMarcus Smith, they formed what police later dubbed the Downtown Posse. Over 3 days, December 24 to 26, they wove a spree of terror across Dayton. 6 victims, 2 survivors, and a town forever changed. It began on Christmas Eve. Heather, Laura, and Marvelous enticed 34-year-old Joseph Wilkerson into his own home under a false promise of an orgy. Once inside, they bound him with electrical cords. Heather helped search his house while the others held him at gunpoint. Marvelous fired the first shot. Laura delivered the coup de grace. Joseph died in his own bed, covered by blankets to muffle the sound. By Boxing Day, the violence escalated. Heather and her accomplices stormed a mini-mart where they executed more victims, including Sarah Abraham and Marvin Washington, seemingly at random and with chilling efficiency. Each killing was a step deeper into atrocity. Motives blurred between robbery and silencing potential witnesses. Heather's fingerprints and presence at each scene would become undeniable. For Heather Nicole Matthews, this was more than rebellion. It was a descent into guilt by association, fear, and rage. She had no criminal record before, yet in 72 hours she bore the weight of multiple murder charges and aggravated robbery. Arrested alongside her cohort, Heather was offered a brutal pact: face the death penalty or plead guilty and accept a life sentence. She chose life. In November 1993, Heather stood before the court and took a plea deal: 2 consecutive life sentences for 2 counts of aggravated murder, plus additional years for robbery, burglary, and attempted murder, totaling nearly 194 years behind bars with no hope of parole until at least 2130. Even within her prison walls at the Ohio Reformatory for Women, Heather's story cracked the veneer of violence. Fellow inmates described her as a mentor, a figure of calm amid chaos. She earned certification as a Stephen minister, offering emotional care to others. In 2024, she took part in the Marysville Women's Art Project, a volunteer initiative that captured her portrait alongside others, a haunting attempt to show the person behind the crimes. Heather insisted that life behind bars wouldn't define her identity. She would not let the worst moments of her past consume everything. Yet the psychological tension endures. Was Heather an innocent drawn into a maelstrom by a more dominant leader, or a willing accomplice who embraced darkness? Her age, 20, still so young, makes the answers murky. Teenagers are impressionable, yet the savagery of her crimes suggests more than naivete. In rare interviews, Heather acknowledged despair. She lamented the life she threw away and the bloodshed she participated in. She spoke of overwhelming force, the grip of Marvelous's volatile will. But she also accepted responsibility, stating that she knew right from wrong and crossed the line. The public responded with fierce division. Some saw a young woman torn by fate and manipulation. Others saw disregard for life too callous to excuse. Heather's participation in prison programs, her attempts at redemption, sparked uneasy empathy. But the families of the victims see it differently. Their loved ones are gone, turned into statistics in time. In prison, Heather's days are survival. Every counselor session, art class, or letter sent home is a bid for redemption. But none can silence the echo of Christmas bullets or bring back the innocent lives extinguished. As she paints or ministers, she carries the guilt of a holiday shattered. And yet something haunts the narrative further. Heather's final words in court. Reports reveal she murmured tears of remorse, words stitched with apology and devastation. She vowed never to let her past define her, yet the bars and the sentences say otherwise. Her freedom was buried with each life taken. Psychologists see her as emblematic of group psychopathy. when a dominant personality ignites moral breakdown in others. They point to the holiday setting, emotional vulnerability, familial pressures, longing for belonging, and how those factors combine to override conscience. But no defense can resurrect the 6 lives lost, or ease the suffering of families whose Christmas celebrations ended in tragedy. Heather's plea deal, her art, her remorse, they echo into the void left by violence. Case 5, Brooklyn Frasy. The night of September 27, 2023, began like a typical evening in Scioto County, Ohio. Streetlights flickered along rural roads, and the quiet hum of neighbors tucked into their nightly routines filled the air. But within moments, that calm would shatter in a terrifying act of violence and alter the lives of everyone involved. Brooklyn Frasy, 42, and her boyfriend, 44-year-old Daryl Scott Donahoe, were engaged in what neighbors described as a heated argument. At some point, the argument turned physical. Scott, riding his motorcycle, attempted to drive away, but Brooklyn was already behind the wheel of her black SUV. Fueled by rage, high speed, and methamphetamine coursing through her system, she began chasing him down the highway at reckless velocity. Witnesses later said her driving was so aggressive, wild, and erratic that at first they thought she was a police officer in pursuit. As the chase spiraled down the long stretch of road, Brooklyn's intentions became clear. She slammed her SUV into the back of Scott's motorcycle, sending him crashing onto the asphalt. But she didn't stop. Instead, she drove over Scott's body again and again, dragging him beneath her SUV for nearly 60 feet. Then, as onlookers screamed and rushed forward with jacks and sheer adrenaline, Brooklyn slammed her SUV into reverse, backing up over him one final time. First responders arrived to a horrific scene. Scott had suffered 14 broken ribs and a ruptured liver. The autopsy would later confirm blunt force trauma. Despite desperate efforts at Southern Ohio Medical Center, he was pronounced dead upon arrival. Brooklyn was arrested at the scene, her face blank, her eyes distant. In her bloodstream, police would find traces of methamphetamine. In her possession, Suboxone, a medication often used in addiction recovery. But the most chilling detail, she denied any intent to harm Scott. Instead, she offered a surreal explanation. She was only trying to get his attention, to warn him that his motorcycle kickstand was down and dragging. Prosecutors weren't swayed. They painted a brutal picture, a domestic dispute that escalated into an act of calculated, fatal violence. They argued Brooklyn chased Scott for 14 miles across public roads, endangering others with willful disregard. She struck him deliberately, dragged him under her vehicle, and stayed behind the wheel, even as bystanders cried out in horror and attempted rescue. During the trial, testimonies cast Brooklyn in a disturbing light. Friends of Scott described him as warm and generous, a far cry from the controlling and obsessive lover some claimed Brooklyn had become. A mournful mother described how the father she had depended on lay broken on the pavement, his life extinguished by someone he loved. In her own defense, Brooklyn pleaded no intent to kill. She claimed confusion, panic, perhaps dissociation. But 8 counts stood against her: aggravated murder, felonious assault, aggravated vehicular homicide, inducing panic, operating a vehicle under influence, and more. Jurors heard the harrowing details. They saw how Scott bled out in the street, alone. They learned how he was dragged under Brooklyn's SUV. They considered the 8 criminal counts. Later, that jury reached a verdict. Brooklyn was guilty of aggravated murder and all related charges. The judge's sentence was unambiguous, a life sentence without the possibility of parole for 34 years, condemning her to die behind bars unless something extraordinary changed. But even after judgment, the psychology of the crime leaves us unsettled. What turned an argument into something so lethal? Was it addiction-fueled rage, a moment of psychotic clarity, a manic impulse born from trauma? Witnesses said at high speed she may have thought the kicking motorcycle was something else, something threatening. Could that be true, or was it a convenient mask for rage and fear? Perhaps the most chilling detail lies in the scale. 14 miles of pursuit, repeated impact, reflexive backing over his body. This wasn't a momentary lapse. It was near total fixation on destroying Scott, a murder that unfolded in the open, at daylight, with witnesses screaming. Even more haunting is Brooklyn's claim that it was all about a kickstand. That single explanation stands in stark contrast to the brutal reality. It raises questions about denial. Was she lying to save her life, or lying to herself to cope with what she'd done? Case 6. Angela Wagner. In the quiet fields of rural Pike County, Ohio, whispers of violence were nearly unimaginable. Then, in April 2016, a wave of blood burst through that calm, a massacre so horrifying it would carve new dark chapters into the history of American crime. At the center of that darkness stood Angela Wagner, mother, accomplice, and orchestrator. Angela, a simple mother of 4, appeared docile and devoted. But beneath that facade simmered a calculated plan born from jealousy and a custody dispute involving her grandson. The target, the Roden family, her son Jake's ex-girlfriend, her children, and allies. 8 people would die in a single night. Men, women, teenagers slaughtered in cold execution across multiple homes. By morning, the bodies lay stiff and unseeing, caught in the crossfire of a family feud exploding into violence. Investigators quickly identified the Wagner family as suspects. Rumors swirled, guns concealed in concrete anchors, family members who vanished into Alaska, false documents, and whispers of betrayal. Angela's courtroom confession later exposed the extent of her role. She had helped plan the murders, drafted the conspiracy, and encouraged her sons to act. She could have stopped the carnage with a single phone call, but she didn't. When Angela Wagner pleaded guilty in September 2021, it was a seismic moment. She admitted to conspiracy to commit aggravated murder and aggravated burglary. In exchange, the state dropped 8 counts of aggravated murder and spared her from a death penalty. Instead, she would face 30 years in prison, 6 of them already served by 2024. The judge's words were unforgiving. She had become complicit in the darkest act of familial violence Pike County had ever known. The sentencing on January 3, 2025, was raw. Inside the packed courtroom, the air crackled with grief and fury. Victims' loved ones stared at her. One mother called her evil. Judge Jonathan Hine reminded Angela that all she needed to do was contact law enforcement to halt the murders, but she refused. Instead, she chose loyalty to her family's darkest instincts. Angela's statement was trembling, layered with regret. She claimed she was broken, trapped by her own faults. "I have regret," she said. "I am more than sorry, but that's not enough." She admitted guilt, yet clung to fragments of denial, pleading for understanding while accepting blame. In prison, Angela exists within stark walls, each echo reminding her of lives lost. Behind her lies the chilling possibility of freedom in 30 years. But even then, there will be no escaping the label. Conspirator to execution, matriarch turned monster. Psychologists describe her as a textbook case of familial influence and moral corruption. When authority and intimacy merge, reason can shatter. Angela's choice to remain silent as violence erupted highlights a darker truth. Evil isn't always reckless. It can be quiet, nurtured in the spaces we least expect. Case 7. Tiffany Ann Powell. In Akron, Ohio, under the shadow of a bitter custody battle, a 32-year-old mother named Tiffany Ann Powell set a trap that would end a life and shatter the lives of many. She and her then-boyfriend, Paul Reed, orchestrated what the prosecution described as the cold-blooded murder of her ex, 69-year-old James Harris, the father of her 5 children. As investigators would later piece together, the crime was no accident. It was a calculated act wrapped in betrayal. On April 26, 2014, James Harris received a message from Tiffany. She needed to talk. Trusting and hopeful, he traveled to her Akron home, unaware that communication would be his last lifeline. Inside those walls, Reed ambushed him. The assault was brutal. James was struck to the floor, then repeatedly slammed headfirst into the ground at least 15 times. Neighbors later reported hearing muffled thuds, but by the time someone peeked through the blinds, it was already too late. When authorities arrived, they found James unrecognizable, his body battered beyond recognition. Paul Reed was arrested first and in February 2015 convicted of murder. Reed's conviction left Tiffany's role under a brutal spotlight. Federal prosecutors argued she had lured Harris there, knowingly orchestrating his demise. At Tiffany's trial, the narrative was damning. Summit County Prosecutor Sherry Bevan Walsh addressed the courtroom bluntly. She lured James Harris to his death. She has shown no remorse and refused to take responsibility for her actions. She left behind tremendous pain which will be felt by James Harris's family for the rest of their lives. That searing statement stung the community. This was no moment of fail. It was a cold maneuver. Despite maintaining her innocence for a time, Tiffany eventually faced a mountain of evidence aimed at her. Jury instruction followed traumatic testimony from Harris's adult children. Descriptions of their father's gentle spirit and selfless love contrasted horrifyingly with the brutal violence inflicted upon him. Prosecutors detailed the disturbing choreography. Tiffany and Reed plotted to remove Harris and erase any obstacle to her parental fight. But as the justice system closed in, Tiffany's story began to unravel. Testimony revealed her complicity. And in January 2016, the jury found her guilty of aggravated murder and obstruction of justice. Sentencing was swift and unforgiving. Akron's Summit County Common Pleas Judge Thomas Teodosio handed Tiffany a life sentence. She would be eligible for parole only after more than 32 years behind bars. An added 30-month sentence for obstruction of justice was ordered to run consecutively. Tiffany sat stone-faced as the gavel fell. Paul Reed, already serving his life sentence, had found some grim sense of twisted justice. But for Tiffany, there was no mitigating plea. The prosecution had dismantled every excuse. This was her design. Even if she didn't wield the physical blow, she'd struck the fatal chord by manipulation. In the days that followed, photographers caught her being led away, her face blank, her posture stiff. Rumor claimed she later sat for an exclusive jailhouse interview, claiming she was still the victim, still wronged by fate more than responsible for a death. But video evidence showed something more. A woman whose denial, hubris, and strategic cruelty led directly to a man lying lifeless on her own floor. Psychologists point to Tiffany's case as a chilling portrait of how revenge and a sense of entitlement can twist maternal instincts into destructive impulses. Her biggest crime wasn't the act itself. It was the calculated betrayal, the emotional hypocrisy that leaves a child's future marred by trauma. 5 children would grow up without their grandfather, scarred by the image of the woman they once called mom. Inside prison, Tiffany remains locked into her narrative. She convinced herself she was targeted by Harris, or that she was trying to safeguard her children. But the truth, now etched into legal record and a broken family, tells a more brutal story, that power, manipulation, and revenge can murder more than a person's body. They murder trust. So what's next? Is Tiffany haunted by nightmares of her father walking into her home, unsuspecting? Does she relive their last moments as tears or curses? We may never truly know, but her case leaves us questioning our beliefs about trust, power, and the lengths people will go to regain control. Case 8. Jessica Groves. It was a warm June morning in 2019 when an Otway, Ohio neighbor first noticed something was wrong. The 2-month-old boy, Dylan Groves, hadn't been seen in weeks. His usual cries were gone. No one answered their door. Weeks later, the unthinkable happened. Firefighters retrieved Dylan's body wrapped in plastic from the bottom of a 30-foot well, and the neatly tied milk crates that encased him made the horror even more unspeakable. Jessica Groves, a former licensed practical nurse in her late 30s, and her husband Daniel, whose son from a previous relationship lived with them, were arrested 2 days before the grim discovery. Investigators discovered even more disturbing evidence. Dylan was malnourished, covered in bruises, and had fractures, some old, some fresh, revealing a pattern of hidden violence. As the prosecution unfolded, a chilling portrait emerged. Jessica, once trusted as a mother, was recast as a monster who tortured her own child. Testimony revealed Dylan was born positive for methamphetamine and amphetamines. He was already living at the edge of life. Despite that, the family was allowed visits after his birth, and yet weeks of absence followed with no contact from his parents. Inside the courtroom, each witness peeled back a layer of this tragedy. Nurses and pediatricians recounted Dylan's first cries of withdrawal. A caseworker described repeated attempts to reach Jessica and Daniel, all met with silence until late March. That was the last time Dylan was seen. His birthday came and went unnoticed. And then came the autopsy. Skull fractures, broken ribs, a shattered arm and shin, injuries that spanned from mere days to weeks before death. Dylan's body had been wrapped meticulously, layers of plastic, blankets, duct tape, and dropped in a well, weighted down to ensure it would never be found. Menacing care in a crime of terror. Daniel Groves testified he discovered Dylan cold and lifeless in his crib on March 28th. He told the court that Jessica had begun striking the baby's head repeatedly during his visits. A teenage son recounted bruises on his baby brother and how Dylan simply vanished afterward. Their home, once a sanctuary, became a house of horrors orchestrated in silence. Jessica took the stand to defend herself, claiming Dylan's death was accidental. She said she dropped him, that the injuries could have been caused during normal handling. Her face was pale, voice cracked with despair, yet the cracks in her story were glaring. She admitted causing the baby's death while refusing to acknowledge ongoing brutality. The jury deliberated only a few hours before returning a verdict. Jessica was guilty of aggravated murder, abuse of a corpse, child endangerment, kidnapping, tampering with evidence, interference with custody, and 4 counts of felonious assault. Daniel was convicted of murder and related charges, but acquitted of aggravated murder, based on his lesser role in the concealment. At sentencing, Jessica's voice trembled as she addressed the judge. "No matter what you do to me, I have to live with this every day. I'm sorry. I have failed as a mother." Her apology echoed through the courtroom, but it landed empty against the enormity of her actions. She would spend the rest of her life behind bars, her fate sealed on what would have been Dylan's first birthday, a grim marker of loss and justice. Daniel received a similar sentence, though with the possibility of parole after decades. This case lingers because it's more than a crime. It's a profound betrayal of trust. A mother, stained by drugs and violence, crafted an illusion of care while plotting her child's death and concealment. The cold precision of Dylan's disposal pierced deeper than any blow. What truly haunts this story is that it didn't happen in some distant place. It happened in a home where love should flourish. Instead, a baby's pain was hidden, his suffering ignored until it was irreversible. Case 9. Sandra K. Inman, March 22, 2011, began as an ordinary spring evening in Logan, Ohio. April's chill lingered in the air as 25-year-old summer cook Inman, a mother of 3, completed her shift as a janitor at the local bank. She was separated from her husband, William Inman II, and embroiled in a bitter custody dispute, not realizing this night would mark her final moments of freedom. Outside the Century National Bank, 3 masked figures forced her into a white Crown Victoria that resembled a police cruiser. Witnesses saw a woman with blonde hair behind the wheel. It was Sandra Inman, Summer's mother-in-law. 2 men, her son and husband, subdued her with a stun gun before zipping her hands and neck with industrial zip ties. Summer cried out as they dragged her into the car, struggling for breath, her fate sealed in under a minute. What followed was a gruesome descent into familial betrayal. The zip tie tightened. Summer's life ended not with open violence, but with suffocating constraint. She was strangled, then disposed of in the septic tank of a nearby church, one intimately linked to Sandra, her husband, and their faith. A septic grave where no one would think to look. For a week, her disappearance baffled the community. Then, acting on a confession from Sandra, who had broken under interrogation, authorities recovered Summer's body. Sandra revealed that panic had consumed them after Summer died, and it was Sandra herself who chose the septic tank to conceal the crime. "It was my idea," she told investigators, her voice cracking. "I thought I could talk to her. Then we panicked." The revelation sent shockwaves through Logan. How could a grandmother, someone expected to protect and nurture, lure her daughter-in-law into a trap? How could she then choose to dispose of her body like a criminal? When Sandra pleaded guilty to murder, kidnapping, tampering with evidence, and gross abuse of a corpse, the full weight of her actions emerged. She received 15 years to life, a sentence many called too lenient given the brutality and premeditation involved. Summer's husband and father-in-law were each convicted of aggravated murder, kidnapping, tampering, and corpse abuse, receiving life without parole. The courtroom became a theater of betrayal and grief. Prosecutors described Sandra as the mastermind, orchestrating the abduction so she could confront her son's ex-wife over custody. When the plan went fatally wrong, shame and fear silenced her conscience, driving her to silence and concealment instead of seeking help. Sandra's chilling admission, "It was my idea," echoed through the hall, an assertion of guilt and a haunting confession of intent. Psychologists note this as a dagger turned inward. The moment one mother's protective instincts were twisted into a weapon, destroying more lives than she could ever repair. What makes this case disturbingly compelling isn't just the act itself, but how quietly it unfolded. No sudden outburst of rage, no horrifying screams, just simple betrayal cloaked in familial loyalty. It took community protest and legal negotiation before Sandra finally spoke, after sowing silence for 7 days. In prison, Sandra lives with the knowledge that her children will grow up without their grandmother, that her actions destroyed more than one life. She will serve her sentence while those around her continue to age, rebuild, and remember. And while she endures, she carries the burden of what must haunt her most. Her final words to investigators, delivered not in denial, but in suppression. "I thought I could fix it." Words that echo with remorse, but come to us too late for summer cook Inman. Case 10. Donna Marie Roberts. Donna Marie Roberts was always outwardly composed. Born in 1944 in Youngstown, Ohio, she climbed the social ladder from college student to plastic surgeon's assistant in Miami. 18 years, 2 marriages, then a final union with Robert Fingerhut in 1983. Their life appeared stable: a home, business ventures at airport car rental and Greyhound terminals, even a restaurant. She seemed like someone who had it all under control. But as Detective Paul Monroe would later testify, the murder scene in Howland Township had none of that calm. It was staged, clinical, cold. All signs that someone had crossed the line from deception into deadly calculation. On December 11, 2001, Nathaniel Jackson, a prisoner with whom Donna had been secretly involved, walked into the Fingerhut home carrying a mask and gloves, items she had provided to him. Minutes later, Robert was found shot dead in his own kitchen. There was no sign of forced entry. The plot was shockingly intimate. A woman, still legally married to her victim, choosing to orchestrate his death from within their shared home. As homicide investigators sifted through the evidence, letters, caller logs, coded instructions, a disturbing image of Donna emerged. While Jackson lashed out violently, she had nurtured the plan. She had financed it. When the deed was done, she even had the audacity to place a phone call claiming ignorance. The irony wasn't lost that the mask and gloves she handed over became central proof of her complicity. Donna's 2003 trial was a study in duality. Witnesses spoke of her gentle upbringing, her years helping others, her steady demeanor. But prosecutors painted a starkly different picture. A calculating woman, motivated by financial gain. She stood to collect more than $500,000 through life insurance and estate interests. She had stood over her husband's body in callous silence, believing she could keep her hands clean by letting someone else pull the trigger. The jury didn't hesitate. Donna was convicted of complicity to aggravated murder and conspiracy. In June 2003, she was sentenced to death, becoming one of only 2 women ever to face capital punishment in Ohio. Appeals followed, bounce-backs from the state Supreme Court, procedural delays, fresh hearings, but by April 2014, her death sentence was reaffirmed. In August 2024, a Sixth Circuit court found procedural errors in her sentencing and ordered a new sentencing hearing, yet under Ohio law, her guilt remains unquestioned. The question now is not whether she is a killer, but how society should punish someone who orchestrated murder through secrecy and financial motive. Behind bars at the Ohio Reformatory for Women, Donna is haunted by the contradiction of her life. A mother, a businesswoman, a planner of violence. Defense teams paint her as a broken woman, manipulated by a lover in prison. Prosecution calls her the architect, who recruited Jackson like a puppet, ensuring she remained one step removed. Psychologists see in Donna a textbook case of moral compartmentalization. Outwardly competent and caring, yet internally cold and manipulative. She hid everything behind a veneer of normalcy. No outbursts, no wild emotions. Just slow, calculated planning that turned love into liabilities and trust into murder. When the time comes for her new sentencing, will empathy for an aging woman tip the scales? Or will her strategic silence, her refusal to fully admit guilt, cement a fate of death? This isn't just a story about a murder. It's a study of how intention matters as much as action, and how someone can hide lethal intent behind kindness. You might wonder, did Donna ever regret her choice? Did she see her reflection and confront the monster she helped create? Some accounts suggest she remains composed. Others hint at cracks behind iron bars. But whether she weeps in private or calculates her next appeal, the image remains. A woman who chose planning over protection, love over life. If this story sent chills down your spine, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more gripping true crime tales. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. And a huge thank you to our amazing community of true crime fans. You're the reason we keep shining a light into these dark corners of the human mind.